I'm Susie Wiseman, and this is Jacobin Radio, and I'm speaking with Rachel Cohen and Sean Richmond, and we're talking about the strikes in West Virginia, the looming strike in Oklahoma, and now we're moving into the Janus case that is before the Supreme Court and will probably be decided in June, but arguments are being heard now. And I'm going to ask you two to both explain it more fully, but everyone is pessimistic that it will end in any other way than public sector unions getting defunded. Some say that the right is doing this in order to defund the Democratic Party, but as both Rachel and Sean have written, that there's unintended consequences. So maybe we could just lay out what that case is, what its ramifications are, and then go into the unintended consequences. And you bounce off each other, so I'm going to let you both do that now. Perhaps maybe, Sean, since you wrote the article in the Washington Post, you should start.
Actually, Rachel, why don't you talk about the operating engineers and the crazy stuff they're doing?
I wrote a story. Basically, so the case, which Mark Janus is saying, it's a violation of his free speech rights to have to pay union agency fees, even though those are not going towards the union's political lobbying work, because the distinction is not meaningful and you can't compel that kind of money, that kind of speech. So that's what the case is about. And while basically the whole narrative thus far, the commentary has been about how this is going to really decimate Democratic coffers. We're going to see what happened in Wisconsin happened all over the country, and it's going to just severely weaken the public sector unions. The International Engineering Union, which has chapters in different states, but they came up with an idea, and they said, I don't think that the plaintiffs are thinking this through enough, because there's two sides to that coin, and there's two sides to that argument. And if Mark Janus says that paying union dues is a restriction on his free speech rights, then there's a lot of different angles you can go with that from the flip side. You could say that a state restricting what people can bargain over is a restriction on their free speech rights. Or you could say that requiring a state to have to cover union representational services for someone who is out there who doesn't support them or is out there trying to destroy their work is a violation of their constitutional rights. Basically, the idea being that for the past 40 years, the Supreme Court has drawn a distinction between the speech of political lobbying and advocacy versus collective bargaining activities. And Mark Janus is trying to say that distinction is not meaningful. We should collapse that distinction. But the argument put forth by this engineering union is saying, if you collapse that distinction, you're going to collapse possibly a lot more with it. And you're going to open the floodgates to all sorts of challenges, and we're already starting. And they already filed 3 lawsuits, 2 in Illinois, 1 in Wisconsin, 1 challenging Scott Walker's infamous law that he signed in 2011 that is responsible for basically depleting public sector unions in his state. And Sean can take it from there, but I think, when I heard about this, and I had already written a piece about Janus, and I've been following out the coverage since Friedrichs, and it's true, very few people, with the exception of Sean, really were running with that threat of it. What are the unintended consequences of collapsing that distinction between collective bargaining and political activities?
And Sean, when you go into this, discussing what this case is really about, could you maybe as well let our listeners know how this differs from the Friedrichs case?
It doesn't.
Well, that was easy.
Replay of it.
Okay.
It's a complete replay of it. Look, what's outrageous about this is that Justice Samuel Alito, this is his theory, he has actively inserted this into cases that it has nothing to do with. And he's been basically soliciting for the vast right-wing conspiracy to bring this argument to the court for years now. He tried to get it into Harris v. Quinn I guess that's going back to 2014. He didn't have enough votes at the time. Friedrichs came along very shortly thereafter. And for Alito to get his way, for him to make agency fees completely illegal and unconstitutional, the court has to say, basically, that every interaction that a union has with the government is inherently political, and therefore, by compelling people to pay fees to their union, it is the government compelling those people's speech by participating in an inherently political organization, even when the union is bargaining over who gets to have Tuesdays and Wednesdays off at the Department of Sanitation. That somehow is a political debate. And so it's so extreme and it's so ridiculous But this is the panicked right wing trying to grab as much power as they can as they are increasingly losing votes and losing power, right? And so it's totally about bankrupting the unions and knocking out the Democrats, get out the vote operation. But if they adopt that reasoning, there's a lot of chaos that can be created. What I love about what the operating engineers are doing is that I'm just a writer. All I can do is write and say, like, hey, this is, who knows what's going to happen. They're just doing it. And so it becomes a lot more real. And I think part of what they're hoping to do, and what I'm hoping to do, is that rather than this being a dry sort of throwaway reference in a legal brief in the case, that folks can point to a body of activists who are saying, like, no, bring it on.
That's what I was just going to say, those exact words.
About time.
Right, but let me just, come in there, because there's also like a lot of disputes. I'm reading a lot of articles where people are arguing with each other over whether or not a negative outcome for unions in the Janus case is necessarily a bad thing, and other things, yeah, it's going to be really bad. But you bring out some silver linings, and you both just talked about free speech, because let me ask, does this mean that everything's going to be settled now, or rather brought to the courts to discuss whether free speech rights have been violated? It's a constitutionally protected your right to free speech. How do you see this? Let's talk about those consequences.
We owe it to ourselves to turn every workplace dispute into a constitutional crisis. Look, this is bad. If we lose Janus, it is bad. Just unequivocally, it's going to be bad. We're going to lose a lot of union members. Unions are going to lose a lot of power on the front end. And so what is our revenge? Our revenge should be turn this into chaos, make them grapple with the implications and play out the thread of the argument that they made. And the pushback that I get more often on what I'm saying from people who understand what they're talking about is, look, these guys are craven. A 5-4 majority that goes with Justice Alito on this doesn't really give a crap about appearing to be reasonable or thoughtful or ideologically consistent, which is true. But the reason they're doing this is that they are panicked that they are going to lose their majority, which means we're going to have more federal circuit courts and eventually a Supreme Court that could be convinced of our arguments. And in the meantime, let's make those arguments. And let's also play out the thread of what the attorney for AFSCME said in the hearings, that agency fee is traded for the no-strike clause in bargaining, particularly in private sector bargaining. You want to knock out one component of the very foundation of what has been a fairly stable labor relations system in this country, then you deserve the chaos that you're inviting.
So in other words, it will bring back the strike. Go ahead, Rachel.
The other thing is that, going with what Sean said about the Supreme Court being nervous, and that's why they're rushing it, people forget how unusual it is that a Supreme Court would take a nearly identical case 2 years apart. They used, with abortion, with the abortion issue, it was 1992, 2007, 2016. The Supreme Court very rarely wants to adjudicate on the same kind of issue for a long time, but then with Friedrichs, they didn't end up doing it, so there was, more of a reason. But I think, there's a reason to think that regardless of what happens with Janus, you're going to have a pretty long time of just kind of chaos in the lower courts, like we see with reproductive rights all over the country. There's tons of court challenges and federal cases and different laws, different states doing different things, and very rarely does it make it up to the Supreme Court because they hear so few things. And eventually it will, but we don't know what the composition of the court will be like that. But the point is just in the way that right now things are just absolutely crazy around abortion all across the country, and they have been for years, you can picture something more similar to that with labor if that's the direction labor decides to go. That's how I think about it.
Well, let's go into a little bit of the history, because, Sean, in your article, you bring out what it was like before the NLRA and the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Act, and the Wagner Act that gave people the right to strike and the right to union protection. If we go back to the days of a really militant labor movement, not saying that this will bring it about, but it will bring about the conditions that you'll get strikes, and strikes, bring about solidarity, as we're seeing, and all kinds of acts that people engage in that they didn't think they were capable of before, acting in unison. So maybe you could bring out some of what happened before and whether you think we're on the cusp of something like that again.
So I used to work for the Hotel Employees Union in New York, and so I sort of love their history and actually wrote my master's thesis on it. There's this famous IWW strike in 1911 in the fancy dining rooms of the hotels of New York. It's an industry-wide strike, and it falls apart when this one organizer basically threatens to poison the rich of the city if they don't recognize the union. So that strike fails. And the workers like the whole wobbly model, but they're like, maybe we're not going to be wobblies because we don't need to have our organizers threatening murder and losing us middle-class support. So they become
That's
an
the
organization
industrial workers
called,
of the world. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so they become a union called the Amalgamated Food Workers. And they were an independent union modeled on Sidney Hillman's Amalgamated Clothing Workers. They were probably the main union for the hotel industry from that time, from 1912 until into the 1930s. And they were competing with the official American Federation of Labor Union, the hotel and restaurant employees, but they were also competing with the building service employees union, thought that they should represent the janitors, the electricians thought they should represent the electricians. And at some point along the line, there was a split within the Amalgamated Food Workers, and there was a communist union called the Industrial Union of Hotel Workers that formed up. And so between 1912 and 1934, there was an industry-wide strike in 1912, there was one in 1918, there was one in 1923, there was one in, I think, 1928, there was one in 1934, and each time the dynamic was one of the unions would spark the strike, hoping that by them making whatever wage demand they were putting on the bosses, and by calling the strike, that more workers would rally to their flag and pay dues and join them, and that they would assert leadership on the shop floor and become the dominant union. I mean, this is a crazy dynamic. Every now and then, the official hotel and restaurant employees unions at the time, which particularly after Prohibition had a bit of a problem with the mafia, would swoop in and would sign an exclusive contract with the bosses at some cafeterias, and they would win. And so this fiercely sort of cutthroat, competitive structure, and there was no labor peace for the hotels. And it was really only after the National Labor Relations Act gets passed, and even though it didn't even apply to hotels at the time, because it was based on interstate commerce, and hotels weren't considered to be interstate commerce until the Civil Rights era, the employers wanted labor peace like a lot of the other industries were getting. They also had like a giant World's Fair that was getting organized in 1939, and they just did not want a strike in 1939. And so they basically begged the unions to merge. And they said, if you guys can become one union, we will recognize you, and we will sign an industry-wide contract with you that applies to all the hotels that are a part of our association, because we just need to know that for at least the 2 years that this World's Fair is happening, that there's not going to be a strike, there's not going to be any job actions. In a microcosm, that is a lot of what happened across industry in general, that where unions finally established a degree of recognition and settlements with employers that were lasting, the employers preferred to deal with just one union because they wanted a guarantee that for the terms of their contract, and these were 1 or 2 year contracts at the time, eventually sort of becoming 5-year deals and longer, they just wanted to know, we're done, that whatever issues you brought to the table, however they were settled, we're done with this. For the next 3 years, you're going to file a grievance if you disagree. You're not going to go on strike. And that is the framework that has brought a tremendous degree of stability to American workplaces for a number of decades until the employers started to tear it apart in the 1970s.